It's not about trying to chase a title or win a title once, but be in that discussion every single year like we used to be and like we should be.
Perennial success is the aim for Ineos, but is Erik ten Hag the man to deliver? We're chatting about the fallout from Spurs, the long-term goals for Sir Jim Radcliffe, and the task ahead for the Dutchman, with Portugal in sight. That and more on the latest episode of The Theatre of Red. In what has been an extremely difficult week to navigate following the most ridiculous of performances against Spurs, Manchester United, in the eyes of the media, have once again entered crisis mode ahead of what many will describe as a critical two-game period for Erik ten Hag. Now, alongside me today, for a second sitting on the Theatre of Red to dissect all, is Mr. James Rhodes from the United Muppetiers. How are you doing today, my man?
Doing well this morning, and I hope you as well. Well, afternoon for you, morning for me, but yes, doing well.
Glad to hear it. Glad to hear it. I'm doing all right. Obviously, the Doom machine is in full flow. And as I've said for many, Erik ten Hag is simply incapable of managing a group of players that are now classified as his team. I do want to get back to that in a bit too, but every single misplaced pass, every failure to make a tackle or commit yourself to a transition or a gut-busting run is the Dutchman's fault. Before I go on, I just want to quote a segment from yourself and Phil's podcast. That football team yesterday would have lost against any opposition because they had already decided they weren't going to go out and compete. And if I'm Ineos, I'm looking at players who went out there on Sunday with no intent to execute the instructions they were given. These are professional footballers who, in many cases, have already highlighted their intent to maximise their own personal gain in opting to make that move to Manchester United. Now, whether reporter A or reporter B decides to optimise traction by suggesting an unease in the dressing room, these players knew that Erik ten Hag was the type of manager that he was before they came. They were aware of his traits before signing. You can even take Matthias de Ligt, for example, there. But furthermore, this is a point that I feel many choose to pick and claw at when it suits them. I mean, I thought Jason Wilcox had a significant part to play in the style of football and influencing tactics and the team dynamic. That's what he was lauded as the saviour of last season, and many tailored the FA Cup win. Why is Wilcox not being mentioned now, and why are the players not being held publicly accountable? Is the manager without fault? No, he's not. But is he the reason the entire team couldn't string two passes together, the catalyst behind offering possession to Spurs in double digits in their opening half within the opening 20 minutes of that fixture? If you, or if anyone else, can sit in front of me today and say that this manager is demanding his players to play like that, when you've even got ex-coaches like Benny McCarthy coming out and saying, tactically, I feel that Erik ten Hag is at the very top, then I just cannot comprehend what people think the likes of Thomas Tuchel or Simeone Inzaghi in recent days would achieve in this environment, both of whom have multiple accounts of confrontation with hierarchy and with playing staff. Am I completely wrong here, James?
No, and I think what happens very often is that narratives will get created and spin out of control. Just to chronologically address a few of the things that you've said there. For example, Jason Wilcox. One of the things that got out of control at the end of last season was the suggestion that he was the reason we started winning games and winning the FA Cup. I've been probably more critical. I would say I would lean towards the more critical side on Ten Hag than maybe the average over the last bit of time. But that being said, when I look into situations like that, I always like to present the reality of it. And there were stories that had come out saying, Jason Wilcox told Ten Hag, you have to play like this. Wasn't the case. And you have to pick these teams and you have to do this and you have to do that. And that really wasn't the case. And I thought it was unfair at that time to suggest that Ten Hag didn't deserve the credit for setting up the team the way that he did. And then you can see exactly how that narrative could be then, like you mentioned, if that was the case then why would the same people not be saying it now? That, okay, well, the team is not playing the way that it should. So isn't Jason Wilcox, if he was supposedly setting up the team and doing all of these things, well, then he's doing it now, isn't he? And that is the truth, is that he wasn't. and he isn't. And he's there, doing a job professionally evaluating, but he was never ever stepping on Ten Hag's toes and telling him how to pick his team. So, it would be unfair, very unfair, to credit the end of last season, the FA Cup win, down to Jason Wilcox and then not give him the blame this year. But he should have neither. Ten Hag deserves the credit for the turnaround at the end of last season, as well as the FA Cup win, and in that share deserves, the look at what's been going on this season. That being said, no, of course, there's always a balance, I would suggest, between players and a manager in any sport, right? One of the And it is a hard balance, and it is a fine balance, because these are professional athletes, and everybody who sits and works in a day-to-day job, like most of us who make a lot of content and watch videos and follow United and do all of that, we all work every single day. And we know that for the most part, we don't really get the excuse to say that we performed poorly in our job because of anybody else. Um, it is not an excuse that will go over well, I promise you, in any job that you are in, to say, well, yeah, I did bad for the last 6 months, but it was because my boss was this and my boss was that. Nobody really gets to make that excuse. And that goes for Ten Hag too, right? For the most part, everybody in their job has to take responsibility for their position. And, the players, what is to blame for that? Because we know that they're capable of playing a lot better than they did. Um, Even if tactically, even if the setup, even if the plan was wrong, even if they got out coached, we know that they're capable of playing a lot better than that. We know that Diogo Dallo is capable of running back and tracking a player in within 3 minutes into the game. We know that, um, and yet they didn't. And so it becomes less a question, I think, of who's to blame, and more, how do we fix it and prevent these things from continuing to happen? Because we've seen it time and time again in the past. And it might be that it means Ten Hag isn't the guy, but in addition to that, there would also be plenty of other things that need to be addressed and dealt with. One of the things I do think is unfortunate, which I'm sure we'll get to, is that, truthfully, I think if this was Ten Hag's first season and there wasn't the history with the club, with the fans, with the players, with all of that, under new leadership, under new ownership, it would look a lot different. And that the way things would be viewed would be different. Now, I also think that might be true of prior managers who haven't made it at United, like Jose Mourinho, Louis van Gaal, that if they had been here under different circumstances, under better ownership, under the current push and drive we have forwards, truly for the first time in a long time under Ineos management, that things might have turned out differently. But that can sometimes be a victim of circumstance as well.
It all really boils down to, we'll say, a media narrative that comes front and center, and that's where Wilcox comes into it. Because obviously, Manchester United sells. It sells twice as much as any
Hmm.
other club that we compete against. That's why the likes of Wilcox was held as this great savior. And it's why it doesn't suit a narrative to start mentioning him when things go against you. But the issue that's there, the fundamental failings of these footballers and not being able to get a song or a tune out of them. I know right now the favourable and the real sort of hot topic is that we're largely dealing with a Ten Hag squad and that we're dealing with Ten Hag players. So ultimately, these are individuals he brought in to be able to complement his style and his ethos in moving forward. I think at the same time, when you're considering that narrative, you can look at the likes of Mr. Mazraoui, Matthias de Ligt, Manuel Ugarte, Joshua Zirkzee, four players who were going to be key in moving forward. They're still only in the club, in the country, in the lifestyle for 2 months. This takes time. Just like you or I, if we uprooted and we went to a different country and tried to get involved with individuals that are totally out of our normal social cycle and the way that we engage on a daily basis, these things take time. I know with Manchester United, with footballers, you're not often given that time. You're not given that grace. You're expected to hit the ground running and you're
Yeah.
supposed to get results yesterday. But these players are earning an astronomical wage. They're playing for the biggest club in the world alongside Madrid, and they've arrived in the knowledge that every little detail is going to be scrutinized within an inch of their life. Now, I see people attempting to unearth everything from tactics to motivation techniques and an ability for Ten Hag to be able to apply a human touch. There is simply no way that any human being is going to convince me that Ten Hag is responsible for these footballers choosing to misplace countless passes and offer possession away routinely. You can call me old fashioned, but should the allure of playing for Manchester United not be enough motivation for each and every member of that squad, regardless of who is sitting in the hot seat, James?
I think so. I do. Because like you say, I'm probably in a bit of both camps because I think they're in parallel, right? Because I think that the problem you have at Manchester United in the end, unfortunately, probably boils down a lot further than the manager and the players themselves. Because when you say that they should, the allure of Manchester United and the prestige of it and these things should motivate players to be great regardless, right? And I agree that it should, but it hasn't. And when it doesn't once, that's okay, and we've gone through the same cycle in a lot of times with players looking and saying XYZ came in, Pogba came in and then he was the reason, right? With that we didn't perform. He was unmotivated, he was lazy. Or it was Anthony Martial that was motivated or lazy. Or it was, Phil Jones. And I say narratives and I say players, it was Phil Jones and he's there and he never worked hard and that's why he was always injured, right? And all of that. But for some reason, we of course have seen at Manchester United over the last 10, 12 years that every player that arrives, you would expect to arrive with that fire. And somehow that fire dims very quickly at United. And, there's from the outside looking in, the feeling, the desire as a fan that you see the big picture. In the day to day, I have to wonder what it's like for a lot of people, a lot of players who join United under the Glazer ownership of it, where you have leadership that has been completely disconnected and an environment that is wasted. I mean, we can bring Cristiano Ronaldo into discussion, barring his and Ten Hag sort of feud, which I think really boils down to strong personalities seeing the same problems, maybe disagreeing on how to fix them and how to go about them, and having a different experience in life and in their careers in getting to that point, but seeing the same issues. Ronaldo comes back to United and sees it, that the club is dead behind the scenes, right? It's not what he remembers. And it's interesting. I was doing a live yesterday and I was talking quite a bit about Sir Alex Ferguson because I was reading through an article from him about it back then. And one of the things that really kind of struck me on it, and I think this is why every manager, fails, quote unquote, at United so far. When Sir Alex Ferguson was at United, of course, he was essentially God of Manchester United. He was the God. If you look at it in a little bit of a literal sense, the individual, the being, the higher power who sets the rules, the laws, the reality, who creates the reality of that zone, of that thing, of that place. Sir Alex Ferguson was God for Manchester United for 20 plus years, right? How long was it, right? And in the end, it was 21 years, 24 years, 25 years. So he did that. Then God left. And what was left behind? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. And that's the unfortunate reality of it. There was nothing left behind. So you get people like Ronaldo who left when God was still present, when God was still in the building. And he comes back and there's nothing. And it's gone. And he can see it. The place has been left in disarray because things don't stay the same. They crumble and they degrade or they improve. It's one or the other. Nothing stays the same. And so when there wasn't the push and the constant, giving of life to Manchester United, then you get death. And that is what is created behind the scenes. To be very philosophical in this segment about all of that, but that is how I see it. Go ahead.
Something is coming to me as you're speaking here because the word environment continues to come up.
Hmm.
The environment that is there, the environment that Cristiano Ronaldo was used to, was this godlike environment where,
Yes.
regardless of whatever situation was occurring, there was perennial competition and perennial success. The theater of dreams was a fortress. Individuals did not have the ability to be able to manifest United in such ridicule as they do today. A
Hmm.
line that comes to mind is that I am a product of my environment. And I always liken it to a movie that I watched years ago, The Departed. And Jack Nicholson plays a character called Frank Costello in it. And instead of being a product of his environment, he famously says, I want my environment to be a product of me. And
Hmm.
when you're looking at Manchester United over the last close to 2 decades, there's been the greatest example of mismanagement, of neglect in terms of what the Glazer ownership has set upon us. And then when you're looking at the likes of Ed Woodward coming in, who is just dealing with things in such a farcical way,
Yep.
you've now got around to a situation where you've had 12, 13, 14 years, as you said, of different players, regardless of whether or not Erik Ten Hag has signed them, but signed by different individuals. And this was the largest problem that we had because you'd bring a manager in, they would last for 2.5 seasons. They'd bring in X amount of players. A new manager would come in with this attrition rate and this conveyor belt that was occurring. And you're constantly having this endless spell of footballers being brought to the football club to work under an unknown dynamic in this
Yep.
environment that is not Manchester United. I know that we have entered the silly season of continental name after name being put forward as the next great shiny option to rectify the failings of Erik Ten Hag and fix Manchester United. And furthermore, despite categoric clarification that Ten Hag requested to bring Ruud van Nistelrooy and Rene Hake to the club, which I have confirmed, people now choose to rewrite this in favor of an altogether different motive. I want to focus on two key points with you because I would love to get your interpretation of both of these. Firstly, I want to backtrack to June, and it's a point that I've been mentioning a lot recently. And it was when Dan Ashworth stated that football fans were essentially doing themselves a disservice by focusing on short term results. That in order to truly gain momentum, not just in football, but in a business, a clear understanding of a situation, we had to focus on medium to long term results. He was adamant about this. And he also alluded to that in the very topic during the interview with himself and Omar Barada before Liverpool 1 month ago. Taking that specific point only into consideration, coupled with the fact that both men publicly backed Ten Hag, how do you feel about that statement at the start of October?
I think it's sensible, right? I think it's sensible, and one of the things, I've taken into consideration and believe as well that is a little bit hard to swallow for a lot of fans. But I recognized it in understanding, Ineos's approach when they were coming in, when they were assessing the situation, when they were evaluating it, when the people they were putting in charge were evaluating it, is that this was a long-term fix, right, for United. These are not people coming in here, they're not managers. They're not players. They're not coming here for 2 or 3 years and then they're gone and they're trying to chase the results during those 2 or 3 years. These are people who, in essence, want to build the club back up to compete year after year after year after year after year for the next 15, 20, 30, 40, endless number of years that keeps United at the top. And Omar Barada said that as well in there. It's not about trying to chase a title or win a title once, but be in that discussion every single year like we used to be and like we should be, and like you'd expect from any top club in a league. And that fix isn't fast. And so, to some degree, there's an irrelevancy to this season in a way that maybe is overlooked. This is, and Ten Hag has said this in his own ways, and I think maybe a little bit clumsily, but I also think it's a little bit hard to communicate to get across to people. Which, when he talks about this being a transition season, or that the club is in transition, some of the point here is that this is not a year to waste. I wouldn't say, because you should always be progressing and always moving forward, but it's a year where the expectations are not really there in the same way that they will be in the future. It's a year where you're building up the foundations. It's a year where you're getting people like Dan Ashworth and Omar Barada, who only started in July, to really look at from the ground up every aspect and process through the football club, where it is, where it needs to be, where it's lacking, and putting the pieces in place to do things properly moving forward. And none of that necessarily means that the players, the coaches, everybody shouldn't be performing kind of regardless. Um, but it is a season where what are the expectations truly? They're not to win the league. They're not really, there's no requirement to win trophies this year. And that's not a lowering of standards, it's an understanding of the reality, because one of the mistakes that we of course have made many, many times is chasing the short term, chasing the immediate. I would point to this when I say, in terms of timing, right? When Ten Hag arrived in the first case, and this was really interesting because I read a quote this is from Sir Alex yesterday when I was reading through this on a stream, and I just found it very intriguing where he said when he arrived, he focused on building a foundation, building a club, and that was the focus, and that was the important thing because he said you don't chase wins because you can chase a win and then lose the next one. And when Ten Hag arrived, we lost the first two games rather famously, very poorly. And immediately the club went into panic mode. The pressure was on. It wasn't like it's okay. Let's ride it out. We're here for the long term. It was instantly reverting back to short term pressures. And I know that that wasn't just Ten Hag. That comes from the club because that's why he was feeling that way. This, of course, leads to enormous amounts of spending on chasing a quick fix to get us back winning games right away. 165 million euros, something like that, on Casemiro and Antony spent after the two losses that United had, which I think is a perfect example and why I say sometimes it's a matter of that timing just being poor, because that wouldn't have happened under the current leadership in the same way. We don't lose the opening game and then go waste a bunch of money, but now you have a manager that is attached to him. You know what I mean? In an unfortunate way, it's attached to his history at the club that this has happened, and that those are players that are sitting there on the bench, not even making the pitch most games now after all that money. And it's hard to detach from that. It's hard to erase that. It's hard to move past that kind of history. But those are the short term thinking processes that the club has been going through year after year with manager after manager after manager that result in these types of failures. And so they are looking now at a different way of doing it that I believe is totally correct. And so the truth of the matter is, if Ten Hag leaves tomorrow or if he leaves at the end of the season, I think it makes very little difference. If he's going to stay, if he's going to go, I think the timing of that through the season makes very little difference. And their view may well be, let's see how well he can do through this season, give him the time to get there, give him the time to settle things down more, give him the time to really fully, properly, and fairly assess how the season goes. And at the end, we can make a far more educated decision as to whether he's the right guy for the following 3 years, not for the following another 6 months, not for the following 12 months, because that's not really the decisions that they're trying to make, right? They're not trying to say who's the right guy to salvage this season. Salvage what? That's not their thinking. That is not their goal. Their thinking is it's a year of transition. It's a year of progress to put the basics in place to lay the foundations. And then we can decide whether Ten Hag is our guy for the long term or not after that, without it necessarily being about trying to blame him for whether we're doing poorly now or whether we did poorly last year or something like that. It's a complicated time. It's a complicated time, and I don't think that the answers will be as clear. And I think, unfortunately for fans, we all have to kind of sit and look at this season not as a throwaway, because that's not what I'm saying, but as a bit of an odd one. It is an odd one, and we've not had anything like it because we've not ever actually had in since a long, long time. New owners come into the building and change things. And even when the Glazers came in, Sir Alex was there, and it kind of glossed over the things that didn't happen for 10 plus years until he left.
Well, it's a totally alien topic, James, totally alien,
Hmm.
because so many of the individuals that will communicate daily on social media either arrived at the start, middle, or end of Sir Alex Ferguson. So we were
Yes.
used to perennial success. When the declines started occurring, it was just year after year of perennial decline as opposed to perennial success. As I made a reference point to, I want my environment to be a byproduct of me, that's very much what was internally there. You're looking at the likes of Ed Woodward, but from a business perspective, really did not know what he was doing. You referenced in Ten Hag's opening games the immediate necessity to make a reactionary purchase. That in
Yes.
itself is not Ten Hag's fault. You know, the club
Correct.
going out and they spent a fortune on Casemiro and Anthony, yet those two players are used as a stick to constantly beat Ten Hag with, particularly Anthony. He is probably the definition of the ultimate downing point on the manager because there was so much money spent on him, and clearly he's not good enough for that team. Now, ultimately, when you scale everything back, I've discussed one side of it, and you've elaborated very well there in terms of what Dan Ashford said. The second part very much just sort of expands on what you were sort of leading out towards the end. It's the topic regarding the Guardian's article that came out a month after Ashford speaking. It stated that Erik ten Hag was not under pressure to finish in the top four this season. Now, a lot of people scratched their head with it and they immediately pulled away and said it's disgraceful, that this isn't the type of mentality that Manchester United's owners or anyone associated with the football club should have, because ultimately Manchester United should be challenging year in, year out for top honours. I mean, yes, that is what we want, but ultimately, the main word that's going around now against this is apathy and how individuals are just content with mediocrity and failure. But I really don't think that's what it is. It's more so looking at the bigger picture, and it's being able to look at it from a logical sense to say, okay, we want to challenge, but ultimately we're so far removed from that as a result of nearly 2 decades of mixed management.
Hmm.
Now, the topic about Ten Hag not being under pressure to challenge for the top four was backed up by several individuals after, and I specifically looked into it myself. From everything that I was told and the information that was previously reported, the goal here this season, as you've referenced, is to generate and maintain a sense of continuity between the first team and the academy, which ultimately will have a distinguishable framework that flowed through every level. Essentially, what we want to have is we want to develop a platform for future success. And that's recently been elaborated on by Omar Barada's 150 project, you know? It offers
Hmm.
further suggestion that although a performance in the level of Spurs is going to be completely unacceptable, that there is a longer term vision here, and it's routinely spoken about by Ten Hag in the media. We know that what happened against Spurs the last day is not acceptable. But at the same time, if there was a different individual in the hot seat now undergoing this, let's just say for argument's sake, it was Solskjaer going through this, almost certainly Erik Ten Hag would be one of the names that was linked with coming into the club to replace him to fix the problems that were there. Now, as we both know, football fans are fickle, James. You and me are fans before anything. The dynamic of a football club can alter overnight. But this is a new dawn in the Northwest, and while Ed Woodward may have responded differently to adversity, it's already been factored into the Ineos end of season review. And despite hearsay, okay, because that's what it is about the likes of Thomas Tuchel, that has been and gone, and even the prospect of, we'll say, increasing the manager's contract to sack him 3 months later just makes little to no sense when you factor the Premier League's profit and sustainability rules into the conversation and the level of detail that Sir Jim Ratcliffe is going to try to eliminate unnecessary expenditure in the club. Where do you stand on the suggestion that this team framework was the ultimate KPI for this season for Erik Ten Hag?
Pretty much exactly that, which is that they have certain targets and measurements that are obviously going to be a little less visible on the outside because it isn't as simple as finish in the top four. And I think under the Glazers, it often was, right? It was that basic. It's just very little observation, no care how, no care in what way. You could play the worst football imaginable and scrape top four, and that would be enough for them to consider it to be a successful season because they get the Champions League money and all of that. When you remove the simple equation of what is your league position from the conversation, it becomes a lot more complex and it becomes a lot harder to see on the outside exactly what that measurement is. Those types of words, the things that are said around, which are accurate, things like game model, things like platform and all of that are a little more vague, right? From a fan perspective to look at and say, what does that actually mean? What does that look like? And it is hard to know. You can't necessarily put it on a stat sheet. You can't necessarily just you can't look at it based on one or two measurements or things like that, or one or two games even at all. But it is there. And that is really the measurement that they have, and that they will be judging based on Ten Hag on over the season, is his ability to implement this and his ability to do that. But it does take time to put those things into place, and it's a complex topic because they really did not want and do not want. They fully and completely intended to give him the season, to do this. That is absolutely the case. They went into the season entirely with that intention, to give him as many tools as possible and the season to do it, and to, at minimum, the season to do it, I should say, so that they could make a full kind of judgment by the end of the season as to how it's gone. Now, obviously, they're looking at how things are going along the way. It is a difficult topic because at the end of the day as well, you know that your fans are your customers. Your fans are also your consumers. Your fans are the people that you're delivering the product for more than anybody else. So you can't ignore entirely if things are getting so bad through a season. Just as an example, things are getting so bad that it is really becoming problematic to the fans. And there is a like a truth to that aspect of the pressure, that sometimes you have to abandon your plans because of those things. But I think that there's degrees of doing so. You don't do it at the slightest drop of the hat, and you still want to stick to your plan overall because it's in the long term. But it is in the balance, right? It is the balance, and it's why they've been a little bit careful, because they're not going to come out and say, "Hey, this season is a waste," because, like you say, you see the reaction to articles like, he doesn't have to get top four, because the reaction is really poor when you say that. And if they really honestly came out and said the way they viewed the season, I think there'd be a bit of an uproar from fans about how they view it. And so it is a balance, because you still need that support as new owners, as new executives, as new people coming in. You still do need to keep fans on side, and not just because they can be fickle and all of that, but they are also truthfully the people paying, right? These are the people spending their money to watch and to attend. And games like Spurs are unacceptable for fans who pay their money and take their time to go to those games. And that's on the players, and that's on the management, that's on the whole club, right? That is not an acceptable product. I mean, you should be refunding people for performances like that, because the product you've put out is not at all okay. If I paid for a movie on a platform and it just didn't work, I'd want my money back, And obviously it's a different experience because you're not getting that guarantee, but the concept is the same. It's an unacceptable product that has been given to fans. And so it's always a balance in the long and the short term of in the short term, the product has to still at least be watchable. It has to be acceptable. It has to breed a feeling of positivity, of some sort of growth, but we know that it's not going to be spectacular now. It will be in the future. And under the Glazers, it was always the short term, only the short term. Only is there satisfaction today. That was all they thought about. No long term thinking. You can't totally swing the other way to where it's only the long term, where the present doesn't matter. That doesn't work for people either. And so it is the right balance. And that is the trouble that they're going to have to sort out. And that's where there can be pressure during the season. Is it going to fix it? I don't know. I was having that discussion yesterday as well. Even then, if like you say, if you let go of Ten Hag and you bring Thomas Tuchel in, is it going to be better this season? I don't know. There's definitely no guarantee of that. I would say no, in my opinion. On that individual in particular, I would say no. If you let him go and Van Nistelrooy takes over as interim, will it be better? I don't know. I pointed to when Ole Gunnar Solskjaer came in for Jose Mourinho, um, it was better for about 7 games, and then it drifted again. And we've seen that with almost every interim decision and every time a manager's been sacked mid-season. Someone comes in. It happens at many clubs. It's very rare, actually, that they sack a coach mid-season and it actually works. In most instances, you end up right where you started at the end of it. So maybe you needed to do it for some reason or another, but it hardly makes a difference for the most part. And that's where I go back and forth on this season, because I kind of understand, not that it's a throwaway season, but whether Ten Hag stays or whether Ten Hag goes, I kind of expect us to end up at the same place at the end of the year. And that's okay. As long as there's progress in building this foundation, then for the long term we'll be set up to succeed. But so yeah, I think though that just answering your original question, it is very much about the platform that is being built and being put together as the measurement of everything that's going on this year, balanced with, it cannot get so bad in the short term, regardless of who's to blame. It cannot get so bad in the short term that it becomes an affront to paying customers, to paying watchers, to paying fans, to attend, to watch, and to take part in this.
I think I'm actually still in the minority at this stage, and it's that minority is getting smaller and smaller every day. I wrote and I spoke in great detail prior to Spurs, and this was even after FC20. Even though it's been a very disappointing start to the season in terms of results, there has been a clear improvement on last season. I mean, we're not conceding as many opportunities. There is clear structure within the squad. And even though our frontline, our attacking midfielders are not putting away the opportunities are being created. And ultimately, with any football team in any league, in any country, if you continue to create ample opportunities, you're eventually going to score. And that was very much what I was shelling out there. And that's the stance that I took. Now, what happened against Spurs is completely unacceptable. And the first thing I did was I tweeted after and I said it's an absolute disgrace for every single supporter in the ground and everyone who's taken the time to watch it, because that is not Manchester United. That was barely something that resembled football. But that brings us to this evening. A very interesting trip to Portugal to face the second placed Liga side in Porto. And one topic that has become a routine conversation since the departure of Sir Alex is the necessity for this team to provide a reactionary spark. And that's not just been under Ten Hag. Given the disappointing result at home to 20, followed by whatever that was against Spurs, now is the time again for a reaction from this group. And when you've got, I suppose, the added incentive within the dressing room of news of Bruno's red card being rescinded domestically, edging ever closer to potentially having a left back available for selection, what are you expecting this evening in Portugal?
My hope is that there's, and we won't know this except what we see on the pitch, right? Is that I think that success and failure are, of course, not accidents in any respect, even on a day to day basis. And so my hope is that there's something that changes behind the scenes between Ten Hag and these players in how they prepare and what they do, what they discuss, and how they go about it. I'll give you an example: the FA Cup. You got the stories about how they did something different in preparation for the FA Cup final. They made this video, they did all of these things, they showed these moments, they got together. They viewed it as a huge game and they treat it that way. And one of the things that I do think is really hard to do, but is probably necessary, is how do you get every game to feel like that? Because if we prepare for this game the same way we prepare for Spurs, why is the outcome going to be any different? If the things that happen in the lead up to a game are the same as they are to another, then you're almost just rolling the dice every day as to whether it's going to be good or bad. I think preparation is everything. And I think that what you do in the lead up to something is everything. So my hope is that if we're going to see a good result and a change, that there's a change in the preparation, that there's a change in the lead up, that there's a change in the way that they do things. And we won't really know as fans. That's fine with me. It's to them. It's in private. It can be it's in the dressing room. It's however they want to deal with it, but that something is done differently. And my hope is just that there's enough. This is where I think there can be a positive to pressure, is the understanding that what has occurred is not acceptable and that something has to change so that the outcome will change moving forward. And so that is my hope, is that at least a positive that could be taken from the pressure, from the disappointment, from the upset, from fans, from media, and all of that, is a recognition that something does have to change. Doesn't mean it means that the manager going fixes it, but something's got to change in there that has to be recognized by the players and the coach to say, how do we do things differently? And that's my hope, that they make a change in their preparation and that results in a different way of going about things in this game that carries forward into the future.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And throughout this entire conversation of nearly 40 minutes now, I've sort of avoided the tactical side of it because I could sit down and I could geek out about tactics for hours on end, James. But there's one factor that I do want to touch on you before we finish up. Much has been made about the impact in a 9.5 that Joshua Zirkzee has supplied. And this was something that I covered in great detail over a year ago while I was featuring Bologna for Breaking the Lines. His ability is undeniable, and his technique, it's an absolute breath of fresh air. But the inevitable discussion about his lack of predatory instinct is clear, and the lack of availability of our new number 9, I believe, has been a huge factor during this period. Now, for context, despite a slow start to life in England, Rasmus Højlund averaged 72 minutes per 90 in his last 16 league fixtures last season. And that was from December the 26th, I believe, until the end of the campaign. During that period, in a 16-game period, he scored 10 and he assisted 2. And for clarity, and it was something that I beat a drum about at that time, Erling Haaland scored 13 and assisted 1. So, with Højlund now in contention to start this evening in Portugal, how have you assessed the front line without an undeniably valuable player at the head of the attack?
Yeah, it's a really good question because this is all about, yeah, without getting too far into the tactical side of this, this is where the you kind of make your money on the balance of things. Because as you said, the contributions that Joshua Zirkzee makes from a build-up standpoint, from a link-up standpoint, from tying things together was completely undeniable. The performance in the first half against Crystal Palace doesn't happen without him creating all those chances. He even, was directly responsible for a number of them. A lot of the good performances that we've seen, a lot of the improvements we've seen have come down to that. But then you also have the opposite side of the coin, right? At the other end of that creativity are the players taking the chances. And one of the things that's been a bit unusual about the season as a whole is that Marcus Rashford hasn't really got on goal outside of Barnsley, right? And the one game in the Premier League he scores in against Southampton, he doesn't have a shot on target, I don't think, in the Premier League outside of that one game. So he's also created a number of chances. And you look at it and you have to figure out, how do we balance this front line where Marcus Rashford is a very talented scorer and player, is basically in a creative role, but Joshua Zirkzee is too. And Rasmus Højlund is probably the best pure finisher in the team, and now he's available. And he was, I think, statistically far and away the best finisher last season for United in terms of the ratio of his shots to goals. Exceptional, exceptional finisher. And he is. He's very, very good at it. One shot, didn't get a lot of shots, but when he did, he scored. And that was very important. That has been something lacking. And finding that balance is interesting. And I think that, to me, one of the best ways that maybe this could be balanced in figuring it all out is, can you get Joshua Zirkzee, Marcus Rashford, and Rasmus Højlund in the same front line somehow? Can you get them all working together? Because then maybe you can get Rashford a little more narrow, and you can get Højlund on the other side as a left footer, narrow, and you can get them closer to the goal where they can do the most damage while keeping Xerxes there. And you have to balance that with the rest of the team. If you lose the width up front, you've got to be able to, I think it's one of the downsides of the inverted fullbacks is that you have to keep all those forwards really spread out. And so there's different ways that this all has to work together. But I think that to solve the goal scoring issue, which I think is a cause of a lot of the other issues from there. When you're not scoring goals, you end up, there's a lot of things that go wrong behind not scoring goals or after you cannot score goals in attempts to solve it. Somehow getting those three working in a team, to me, would be the best way for United to start scoring goals regularly, consistently, and in bunches. Because I think they are your three most well-rounded players who all offer something at an extremely high level. And there's no doubt we've got to get goal scorers closer to the net. And historically, the only two players who have a consistent record of scoring goals. Of course, Marcus Rashford, scored a lot of goals for Manchester United in his career. And Rasmus Højlund, we know what a lethal finisher he is. So somehow getting those two players closer to the net has to pay dividends and should be a focus.
I'm glad you said that because that's an exact conversation I was having with my brother yesterday. Even though some people would probably try to take my head off at the prospect of both Ahmed and Garnacho sitting on the bench, if you can have a front three dynamic of Rashford, Xerxes, and Hoyland with a sustainable midfield three behind, I think you have
Yes.
ample avenue for that front three to interchange and ample avenue for goals to come in bunches. Last question, really straightforward. What are you anticipating this evening in Portugal? Will they get the job done?
I gotta separate my head and my heart a little bit on the answer because I definitely waver back and forth almost minute by minute on whether I expect to see a change or whether I feel sadly that it'll be more of the same. I'm gonna go pessimistic because I'd rather be surprised and say that they haven't changed yet and that they haven't really got it right to change things and that it'll maybe be a scrappy 1-1 draw type of game. It's a very difficult environment to play in, I think, and I'm not sure that they're going to be ready for it following Sunday. So a 1-1 draw is what I will go for.
Well, let's just hope you're pleasantly surprised when all is said and done.
Yes.
James, as always, great chat, my man. What have you got coming up over the coming days and weeks?
Just the usual things. Pre-matches discussions, post-matches discussions, all the normal things on the day-to-day basis. And then over the international break, I'll be trying to put some different pieces together, on hopefully some of the bigger topics because people have been asking for things like what's actually been changing behind the scenes at the club since Ineos took over. And it's a lot. Just on that note, to go slightly off topic, if you're on LinkedIn, for example, one of the things you will see is every single day more department heads from Manchester United are leaving and taking up other positions. And it's very kind of surprising. And it's not something that goes in the media because these are just your ordinary people. But I was surprised even knowing that this was happening to see a log on and there's five more people saying today's my last day at Manchester United and they're the head of some major department. Very surprising. And it's all this sort of voluntary redundancy going on. So anyway, things like that I want to cover just to give a little more insight in all of the changes that are going on behind the scenes because a lot of that is happening and it's not to say that it's all good necessarily. It's never great when people are always, are losing their jobs or leaving positions. It's not that they're all failures or something like that as people might want to paint things at times. It's just change. And when new owners come in, these changes definitely happen. So a few things like that I want to create over the international break to provide something a little different.
Provide something different, keep yourself busy. And for individuals that aren't
Yes.
following you, James, how can they get in contact or keep up to date with all this content that you're planning?
Yep. So just on Twitter or X, I suppose, I post everything that I make there. Muppetiers, Twitter at Muppetiers, and then we've got from there links to Discord, YouTube, um, everything within that is easy to find. So that's the best way.
He's not able to hide very easy, ladies and gentlemen. And as always, feel free to drop me a message at Shaun Connolly 85 and follow the social for the show and the site at theatre_of_red on every platform. Lastly, if you're still here, please subscribe, leave a review. Your feedback means the world. I genuinely mean that. Enjoy the football. Hopefully we're talking about a win and I'll catch you all next week.